Hey, world history students. Today we'll be learning about the Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991. And if you think about that amount of time, 1947 to 1991, that's a long time. As you can see from the flags I put up here, if you recognize the flags of these countries, it was the United States versus the USSR for the most part. Other countries did get involved. We'll talk about it. First, let's start with the learning objectives. Remember, these are the things you should be able to do by the end of the lesson. First, explore how the US and the Soviet Union became superpowers and vied for global influence. Vied meaning they're both wanting more global influence than the other one. Second objective, understand how post means after, World War II treaties and agreements reshaped national boundaries and birthed multinational organizations. Let's talk about those things in the lesson. Let's connect our last lesson and then we'll talk about the stuff and then we'll tie the two together. So our last lesson we ended with World War II. We talked about how it ended, what was happening, specifically in Germany. If you remember, we talked about how Germany was divided in half. You can see an outline of Germany on the slide. The east side of Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the west side was controlled by France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And then the city of Berlin itself, which is inside of Germany, the capital city, is further divided into an east and west side. So that kind of leads you into what's happening in this lesson. There's tension between the two groups who used to be allies. Remember, USSR and France, United Kingdom, and United States used to all be on the same team for World War II. What was the Cold War? Well, it was the United States versus the Soviet Union, also known as USSR. It was a period of tension and rivalry. It wasn't outright fighting. The United States and the USSR never fought each other in a battle, and it says so in that second bubble. It was cold because the two sides never directly fought each other. They fought through others in Korea and Vietnam, and they supported, like the United States would support countries that opposed communism, and the Soviet Union would support countries and people that wanted communism. So they kind of fought each other through other people, but there wasn't any direct fighting between the two sides, which is why it's called Cold War. So the reasons for the tension, let's look at communism. In theory, the term communism, you can see there's community or communal are similar words to communism. The theory is everyone should have the same amount of everything: money, food, supplies. So there's no rich and no poor. You don't make money, the government gives you what you need. Many poor workers around the world thought this was the way to go. If they were making a lot less than other people and they saw rich people who had everything they wanted, they would often go for communism because communism makes everybody equal. So they fought for it. And many people feared communism because for it to work, someone has to be in charge of collecting everything and then redistributing to make sure everything is equal. Spoiler alert, in practice, there was never a country that distributed everything equally. Even countries who are communist today do not have the government redistribute everything equally. It just doesn't work like that in practice. So in theory, it sounds like that could be good, but in practice, so it's an ideology where the government controls all aspects of society. It's often associated with the Union. Nowadays, China and North Korea, you hear communism associated with them because both of those countries are communist. So, in practice, the government that controlled where the resources went did not distribute resources equally. And as a result, many people died. Millions of people in the Soviet Union died as a result of not getting the resources they needed under the communist rule. All right, continuing on. Terms you should know: containment. Containment is the US, it's a foreign policy. Foreign policy is a strategy to deal with other countries. So, a foreign policy in the United States during this time was, let's contain communism. It's already taken over the Soviet Union, used to be Russia, and let's just make sure it doesn't spread from there. Let's contain it. So I put stop signs around the map of Russia. Another term you should know, the Iron Curtain, and this term was coined or made up by Winston Churchill. You see a picture of him there. He was a prime minister of the United Kingdom. He basically said there's a symbolic curtain that separates Europe from all the countries controlled by the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain is not a real curtain. It's just just a symbol of what the tension was between countries in Europe. Here's a map to kind of show where the divide was. So the Soviet Union is the dark red, pinkish, and then the pinker countries are countries like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania. They were controlled by the Soviet Union. They were owned by the Soviet Union. And sometimes this plays into politics today as Russia believes that these former countries that belonged to communism and the Soviet Union should be part of Russia again. The other countries, the Western aligned nations, are in the darker bluish purple. Some countries are neutral, but they're usually on the side of the West. And then there are other colors that explain different states as well. So the curtain would be separating the pink from the blue. Arms race and MAD or MAD. So these are things that happened in the Cold War. An arms race is any time there's competition between two countries or multiple countries where they want to have more weapons and military power than the other side. So once one country gets ahead, the other country is scared that the other side's ahead and then they pull ahead. So it's a never-ending race until the arms race is over. But as we've talked about, this time period, there were atomic weapons, there are nuclear weapons, and these countries are developing bombs that could potentially destroy both countries and make them completely barren. So, this idea of mutually assured destruction that if one of the countries were to attack the other, that country would fight back until there would be no USSR and no United States. They would basically destroy each other. They would assure that they were both destroyed. If one country fired one of their bombs, basically they believed that would be the end of both countries. So that's what mutually assured destruction is. Another part of the Cold War that isn't as intense is the space race. So the space race, they're in an arms race, they're making weapons, but they also want to be the best scientifically. So they're competing with each other to see who can get to space first, who can develop the most when it comes to space exploration. So looking at a timeline, we've got all of the things that occurred in the space race. I put a few on there. So on this timeline, we've got the first satellite, it's called Sputnik. Soviet Union won on that one. The first dog in space, Soviet Union. The first photograph of Earth from orbit was the United States. The first satellite recovered intact. Before this point, before 1960, they would just let the satellites crash and they didn't get them back. So the first satellite recovered was by the United States. First animal returned alive is 1960 by the Soviet Union. First human, Soviet Union. First woman, Soviet Union. First human on the moon is the United States. And the first craft that landed on Mars was 1971 by the Soviet Union. So, like I said, I didn't include all of the different parts of the space race, but often, funnily enough, in the United States, we talk about the space race ending with the first human on the moon, and we say we won this space race. In terms of where it ends, different people disagree on what counts as the end, but you can see that the Soviet Union won in a lot of other things. Along with the Cold War, what's going on in the world and other countries are international organizations are forming. After World War II, there is a group of countries, in fact, most countries are part of the United Nations. It is an international organization to promote peace and cooperation. Their job is to not have war anymore, not have conflict anymore. So the job of the United Nations and the countries that are members of it are to stop war. They say, "We're done with war. World War II was the last one. Let's not have any more." They still exist, and people argue on their effectiveness still. NATO, NATO, is known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a group of allies. Their mission is to promote peace and work together, and they're going to protect each other if there's a threat or attack. NATO is not as inclusive as the United Nations. NATO was actually first established because they were afraid of the Soviet Union's power. The Soviet Union is not a part of NATO. So the goal is if the Soviet Union attacks any country that belongs to NATO, the other NATO countries will have to protect the country the Soviet Union attacked. That was the purpose. Another international organization, international meaning lots of countries, is the Non Aligned Movement. Many countries were frustrated at the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. They didn't want these two superpowers to interfere with their country again. So non-aligned movement are countries that say we're not taking sides in this. We want cooperation. No sides in this. So that's another example of an international organization. Another thing that was happening in this post World War II Cold War era is decolonization. We've talked about colonization and how it was mostly European countries who were going out and claiming land and claiming to be in charge of other people. From 1945 to 1960, a lot of countries gained their independence. They got rid of European control and they became more independent. So, this is the process of these countries gaining independence from European countries. It's significant because a lot of these countries had been controlled for over 100 years. So, looking at the list, India gained independence in 1947, and I put the country that used to control them. I put a little picture of a flag next to him. So they were controlled by the United Kingdom. Libya gained independence in 1951. That flag is Italy. Indochina, which is currently the countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, gained independence from France. Indonesia gained independence in 1949 from the Netherlands. Morocco and Tunisia, that one of those flags is wrong. That should be France. France and the Netherlands have similar flags. They're just facing different ways. So Morocco and Tunisia gain independence from France and Spain. Ghana gains independence in 1957 from the United Kingdom, Algeria from France in 1962, and Kenya from the United Kingdom in 1963. A lot of these countries are in Africa or South and Southeast Asia. So these countries are gaining more independence and they can actually now they're in charge of their own country, which was unique for them. So let's connect our last lesson to this lesson. So the end of World War I saw the Allies drawing apart as the Soviet Union embraced communism. Their former allies, the allies that they had in World War II, became more wary and tensions grew. We talked about this. So these tensions resulted in an arms race, a space race, mutually assured destruction, proxy wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and strict foreign policy on the spread of communism. So that refers to the United States saying we're going to contain communism, whereas the USSR, their foreign policy was let's encourage communism. We want other countries to be communist because then they will be our allies because we have the same system of government, the same economic system. Let's end with some questions. So, in what ways did the space race impact Cold War rivalry and global perceptions? How did the strategies of containment and decolonization shape the geopolitical landscape during the Cold War? Geopolitical just means relationships between countries that are based on geography or borders. So, how did the strategies of containment, how did containment and decolonization, which are both words we've defined, shape relationships based on geography during the Cold War? And lastly, how did new international organizations react to tensions in the Cold War era? Now, we talked about what the international organizations were. We talked a little bit with NATO, how they reacted to tensions, but What do you think the best strategy would be when dealing with tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union? Things to think about. Well, you finished the lesson. Congratulations.